Hello everyone, thank you for being here. Hope you have a relaxing and comfortable time with Stories for Happy Life channel. The clock on the dashboard flashed 9:07 a.m. as Michael Everett pulled into the crowded parking lot outside the county courthouse in Columbus, Georgia. He shut off the engine of his sleek silver sedan, sighing deeply. The morning had already spiraled out of control. Michael was accustomed to tight schedules and demanding days. After all, he was an accomplished federal attorney known for his unwavering discipline, but today had thrown him completely off rhythm. His morning had begun with an urgent phone call about a high-profile federal corruption case. Defense attorneys had submitted a surprise motion overnight, forcing Michael to delay his scheduled hearing at county court, where he planned to dispute a recent steep property tax increase on his childhood home. The house wasn't merely property, it was sacred ground. Raised by his grandmother after his parents passed away, Michael had learned everything there: integrity, hard work, and resilience. Allowing it to slip away due to unjust taxation wasn't an option. He hurriedly straightened his navy suit jacket and tightened his black tie. Professionalism mattered deeply to Michael, especially today. It was his chance to honor the legacy of a woman who had worked tirelessly to ensure he never lacked the tools to succeed. Jogging quickly up the courthouse steps, Michael checked his watch again. 9:12 a.m. He knew the judge's reputation. Judge Walter Braxton was notoriously strict about punctuality. He'd heard stories from colleagues about the judge's iron grip on court decorum, but Michael trusted that reason would prevail. He was ready with the necessary evidence, confident in his ability to clearly articulate the situation. Michael navigated through the heavy oak doors into the marble-floored hallway, where people anxiously awaited their hearings. The courthouse interior felt old and oppressive, decorated sparsely with brass fixtures dulled by time. He quickly identified Courtroom 301 and slipped inside quietly, careful not to disrupt the proceedings. The courtroom was moderately filled. Michael took a seat toward the back, flipping through his meticulously prepared file. He carefully reviewed documents again, determined to present his case clearly, despite the delay. Judge Walter Braxton sat atop his bench, a towering figure with silver-gray hair combed neatly back. Braxton's sharp, cold eyes scanned every inch of the courtroom, missing nothing. The judge commanded absolute authority, and Michael felt a sudden, uneasy sensation he rarely experienced in federal courtrooms. Cases proceeded swiftly, Braxton ruling quickly and curtly. A young woman quietly slipped into the courtroom at 9:18, and minutes later, a casually dressed man walked in unnoticed. Both latecomers drew no reaction from Judge Braxton. Michael made mental notes, observing these events carefully, assuming the judge was perhaps more forgiving than the rumors suggested. Finally, at precisely 9:30, Michael heard his name called. "Michael Everett?" Braxton's voice sliced through the air, authoritative and impatient. "Present, Your Honor," Michael replied, rising and moving toward the podium, case folder in hand. Braxton's eyes narrowed immediately as Michael stepped forward. "Mr. Everett, you're late. Does your federal title somehow grant you special privilege to disrespect this court's time?" Michael paused, briefly taken aback. "My apologies, Your Honor. An urgent federal matter demanded my immediate attention this morning." Braxton raised a dismissive hand, cutting him off. "Excuses will not suffice. This courtroom operates on punctuality and respect. Consider yourself formally reprimanded for contempt, accompanied by a fine of $800. The room fell silent, dozens of eyes fixated on Michael. It was an unusually severe fine, especially given the leniency Braxton had shown toward other late arrivals. Murmurs began rippling through the room. Michael took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. "Your Honor," Michael attempted calmly, "with all due respect, if I could explain." "You may not," Braxton interrupted, voice coldly unwavering. The fine stands. You will learn to respect this court's authority." Michael's jaw tightened slightly. He glanced around discreetly, noticing a few spectators shaking their heads, uncomfortable with the stark disparity. It wasn't merely the severity of the punishment that bothered him. It was the unfairness he sensed beneath the surface. He'd spent enough time in courtrooms to recognize subtle biases hidden behind official protocol. "Understood, Your Honor," Michael replied, voice even, deliberately neutral. He quietly stepped back from the podium, returned to his seat, and reopened his folder. But this time, his notes focused less on the property tax case and more on the disturbing pattern he'd just witnessed. Michael glanced briefly toward the others who'd arrived late, both unaffected by Braxton's wrath. Neither had received even a glance of reprimand. He quickly pulled out his phone, jotting down detailed observations and timestamps. Something inside him shifted profoundly. He had walked into the courthouse expecting a straightforward hearing. Now he found himself immersed in a far more significant and troubling matter. Michael knew this wasn't about a mere fine or tardiness anymore. It was about principles of equality and justice, values he had sworn to uphold as a federal prosecutor. Today had quickly become much more than just another morning in court. As Judge Braxton's voice continued to echo through the room, Michael formulated his next steps. He would not let this pass unchallenged. Today, the judge had underestimated the wrong attorney. Michael spent the remainder of the session meticulously noting each discrepancy in Judge Braxton's conduct. His finely tuned instincts, honed from a decade in federal courtrooms, made every subtle bias glaringly obvious. The municipal court was different from the sterile, orderly chambers he frequented at the federal level. It was noisier, less predictable, but no less significant. Justice here impacted ordinary lives in profound ways, and Michael felt the weight of responsibility growing by the minute. Braxton continued, seemingly unaffected, issuing swift judgments with an almost bored efficiency. But Michael was no longer merely a spectator waiting to present evidence on property taxes. Instead, he was a federal prosecutor examining a new kind of case, one involving a fundamental miscarriage of justice hidden in plain sight. To his left sat a young woman, possibly in her mid-20s, texting quietly. She had arrived nearly 20 minutes late, yet faced no reprimand. Michael observed how effortlessly she had slipped under Braxton's radar, invisible in a way he never had been. To his right, a man in casual clothes had walked in even later, breezily taking his seat as if timing didn't matter. Both incidents appeared minor in isolation, but taken together, they told a troubling story of selective enforcement. The implications were unsettling. Michael knew racial disparities existed in judicial systems, but to see it unfold firsthand, so casually, so blatantly, struck him at a personal level. Memories resurfaced of his early career struggles fighting skepticism and bias at nearly every turn. It was never overt, always subtle, but equally corrosive. Now, years later, as an accomplished federal prosecutor respected by peers and judges alike, he'd mistakenly believed he'd risen above such indignities. Yet here he was again, singled out and made to feel small, reduced to stereotypes he had spent his career disproving. When his property tax issue was finally addressed, Michael again approached the podium. Braxton, expression unreadable, scanned through Michael's evidence quickly, offering minimal acknowledgement. "Your documentation seems thorough," Braxton conceded flatly, barely meeting Michael's eyes. "We will revisit this matter after further review." Michael didn't respond immediately, sensing that Braxton hoped to quickly brush past the uncomfortable tension lingering in the air. But Michael had come to court prepared for confrontation, not one he sought, but one he would not avoid. "Thank you, Your Honor," Michael said calmly, choosing his words with deliberate care. "However, before I leave the podium, may I respectfully request clarification on today's fine?" Braxton's eyes narrowed slightly. annoyance flickering visibly across his face. "What exactly requires clarification, Mr. Everett?" Michael stood straight, voice calm yet assertive. "Simply whether the penalty imposed on me aligns with standard procedure. I couldn't help but notice other individuals arrived late this morning without receiving similar reprimands." A tense silence swept through the courtroom. Nearby, several spectators shifted uncomfortably. Braxton's grip tightened on the documents before him, his jaw visibly clenching. "Are you implying something, counselor?" Braxton asked sharply, voice edged with warning. Michael remained unwavering. "I'm seeking to ensure that the court applies its rules fairly and equally to all. It's crucial not only to justice but to public trust." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. People who had been quietly absorbing proceedings now watched with heightened interest. Few had ever openly questioned Braxton's authority in this courtroom. Braxton leaned forward, his posture more aggressive. "Mr. Everett, this court has always maintained absolute impartiality. Any suggestion otherwise is unfounded and frankly offensive." "With respect," Michael replied steadily, "impartiality is best demonstrated through consistent action. Today's events suggest inconsistency, and addressing that openly can only strengthen this court's integrity." A momentary quiet filled the courtroom, broken only by the low hum of air conditioning. Braxton, visibly irritated but mindful of watching eyes, sat back slowly, choosing his next words carefully. "Noted," Braxton finally said curtly, voice brittle with controlled anger. "But you've made your point, counselor. Now, please take your seat." Michael inclined his head respectfully and returned calmly to his place in the back row. As he sat down, he caught glances from others in the courtroom. A young man across the aisle nodded subtly. A woman near the exit smiled cautiously. Even the court clerk briefly lifted her eyes from her keyboard, exchanging a swift but knowing glance with Michael. His challenge had resonated deeper than he had anticipated. Throughout the remainder of the proceedings, Michael could sense a palpable change in the atmosphere. Braxton's words grew more clipped and businesslike, as if trying to regain lost composure. But Michael's statement hung heavily in the air, an implicit indictment not just of Braxton's personal bias, but of a larger, pervasive issue that many in the room had silently endured. When the court finally adjourned, spectators filed quietly out into the hallways. Michael lingered briefly, organizing his notes and evidence. As he moved toward the door, an older African-American man who had sat quietly near the front reached out, gently touching his elbow. "Son," the man said softly, voice weathered yet resolute, "I've been coming here a long time. Nobody ever spoke up like you did today. Thank you." Michael felt a rush of emotions, gratitude mixed with renewed resolve. "I only did what anyone should," he replied, humbled. "Fairness shouldn't have to be fought for. It should be guaranteed." The man smiled, eyes glistening with quiet pride. "Maybe it should, but sometimes it takes someone like you to remind folks of that." Michael exited the courthouse and paused on the marble steps, squinting briefly into the midday sun. He pulled out his phone, quickly composing a detailed email to his federal office assistant. "Pull all available court records on Judge Walter Braxton," he typed swiftly. "Cases, fines, patterns of judgment, everything we can find. I want to see the full scope." Sending the email felt symbolic, a quiet but firm declaration. Michael was officially no longer an observer. He was actively engaged in a battle for justice that reached far beyond his property taxes. He knew instinctively that today's encounter marked only the beginning. Yet, rather than feeling apprehension, he felt clarity, a sense of purpose he hadn't anticipated. Standing on those courthouse steps, Michael was no longer just defending himself. He was preparing to stand up for every person in that courtroom who hadn't had a voice. Whatever lay ahead, Michael Everett was ready. Michael Everett spent the next several days immersed in meticulous research. At his desk inside the Federal Prosecutor's office, he pored over mountains of documents, court transcripts, sentencing records, and fine schedules from Judge Braxton's courtroom. The deeper he dug, the clearer the troubling pattern became. Braxton's judgments displayed stark disparities, especially when it came to fines imposed on minority defendants. The evidence was undeniable. Black defendants consistently received harsher penalties for the same infractions as their white counterparts. Michael felt a familiar, steady fire building inside him, a righteous anger that he had learned to channel into action. Late one afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the blinds of his office, Michael's assistant, Denise, knocked softly on his doorframe. Denise was an efficient, deeply committed paralegal whose sharp instincts had been invaluable over the years. She carried a thin stack of files, her expression serious but hopeful. "Found something important?" Michael asked, gesturing for her to sit. "Definitely," she replied, spreading papers across his desk. "You'll want to see this. Braxton's fines are consistently 2 to 3 times higher for African American defendants, even when controlling for the exact same offenses. It's blatant." Michael sifted through the pages, his jaw tightening with each new revelation. Denise pointed to one particular instance. "Look here. Last month, Braxton fined a young black mother $500 for a minor zoning violation. The same day, a white business owner facing similar charges was let off with only a verbal warning, and it happens repeatedly." Michael rubbed his temples. "Have we reached out to these defendants?" "I've started making discreet calls," Denise replied. "People are scared, but some are willing to talk. They just needed someone to listen." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "Let's arrange a series of interviews. Document their testimonies thoroughly. I'll want to submit these as part of our formal complaint." As Denise left the office, Michael glanced at the photo framed on his bookshelf. A younger version of himself standing proudly next to his grandmother outside her small home. She had always taught him that true strength lay in speaking up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Now, facing the enormity of the injustice uncovered, her wisdom resonated louder than ever. By the following week, Michael's efforts expanded beyond mere paperwork. He began interviewing defendants, many of whom arrived hesitant and wary, uncertain if their stories would matter. One evening, a soft-spoken elderly woman named Gloria Richardson entered his office, clutching a worn handbag. Her posture was dignified but weary, and when she spoke, her voice trembled slightly with emotion. "I was fined $600, Gloria began, "for contesting an unfair tax hike on my family's store. Braxton barely let me speak, said I was wasting his time. But a white business owner right after me argued nearly the same issue and had his fine waived entirely." Michael recorded Gloria's account diligently, her dignity reinforcing the seriousness of his task. After she left, he stared quietly at the notes on his desk. Each interview deepened his resolve, confirming what he already knew. This was a systemic problem demanding immediate action. In the days that followed, Michael widened his circle of contacts. He quietly reached out to local attorneys, community leaders, and civil rights activists in Greenville. The response was swift and unified. Many were well aware of Braxton's reputation, but had lacked concrete evidence or the leverage to challenge him. One afternoon, as Michael walked out of a community center after interviewing several defendants, he was approached by David Keller, a veteran journalist known for covering civil rights issues across the South. Keller extended a firm handshake, his demeanor sincere and focused. "I've been following what you're doing," Keller said plainly. "This isn't isolated. Judges like Braxton operate quietly everywhere. Most folks feel powerless to speak up. Your voice matters." Michael considered carefully before responding. Media attention was a double-edged sword, but awareness and accountability often required public scrutiny. "I appreciate that," Michael replied. "But right now, we need to protect the people who've come forward. If we go public, We must ensure their safety first." Keller nodded understandingly. "When you're ready, I'm here. Stories like these deserve to be told, truthfully and powerfully." Days turned into weeks, and evidence continued to pile up. Michael's team discovered a critical ally in Monica Rivera, a former clerk who had worked closely with Braxton until recently, transferring to another jurisdiction. Monica approached Michael privately, visibly anxious but resolute. "I kept notes," she revealed, handing Michael a small, carefully guarded notebook. Dates, cases, even comments Braxton made off the record. "I always knew something wasn't right, but nobody ever did anything." Michael thumbed through the notebook, instantly recognizing its value. Monica had recorded instances of overt bias, even comments Braxton had casually made behind closed doors. It was dynamite evidence, capable of shifting the balance decisively. "You're doing something now," Michael assured her gently. "This takes courage, Monica. Thank you." With Monica's notes, combined with first-hand testimonies and quantitative data, Michael prepared a comprehensive report. When he submitted his findings to the Judicial Review Commission, he felt not triumph, but a profound sense of duty fulfilled. Justice was never a solo act. It required collective effort, courage, and sacrifice. By the time he returned to his office after filing the formal complaint, Michael was exhausted but energized. He understood clearly the scale of the challenge ahead. Braxton wouldn't fall quietly, nor would the systemic injustice he represented vanish overnight. But for the first time since entering that municipal courtroom, Michael felt genuine optimism. His grandmother's lessons echoed clearly now. Every battle worth fighting was difficult, and every fight started with someone refusing to be silent. His phone buzzed, a brief text from Denise. News broke. "People are already talking. You've started something important." Michael smiled slightly, not in victory, but in acknowledgement that the wheels of change were finally turning. A ripple of awareness had begun in Greenville, but it was spreading fast, destined to grow into a wave that could reshape the very landscape of justice in South Carolina and perhaps beyond. In that quiet moment, Michael Everett knew two things for certain. The hardest part lay ahead, and there was nowhere else he'd rather be. Michael Everett awoke to the shrill buzzing of his phone, jolting him from a restless sleep. He rubbed his eyes, adjusting to the pre-dawn gloom. The caller ID displayed Julia Sanders, his supervisor and the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of South Carolina. An early call from Julia rarely brought good news. "Michael," she said, her voice tense but determined, "have you checked your email yet?" "No," he replied, sitting up quickly. "What's happened?" "The Judicial Review Commission acted faster than we anticipated. They've called a public hearing into Braxton's courtroom conduct. It's set for next Thursday, and it's open to the press." Michael took a deep breath, processing the implications. The speed of the announcement signaled the seriousness of the findings. It also meant the quiet scrutiny he'd anticipated had become a very public confrontation. "I'm ready," Michael responded firmly. "We knew this was coming." "I know you're ready," Julia replied, a hint of pride softening her tone. "But brace yourself. Braxton won't go down without a fight. The media storm will be intense." After hanging up, Michael checked his email, confirming Julia's message. Already, several major news outlets were reporting on the hearing, framing it as a groundbreaking examination of systemic bias in South Carolina's judicial system. His name appeared in headlines as the federal prosecutor spearheading the investigation, thrusting him suddenly into a public spotlight he'd neither sought nor desired. In the days leading to the hearing, the tension in Greenville thickened. Local media stations buzzed with anticipation, with debates erupting online and across dinner tables. Activist groups rallied outside the courthouse, holding signs calling for equal justice. Despite the charged atmosphere, Michael remained laser-focused, preparing his presentation meticulously, aware that the entire city, and soon much of America, would be watching closely. When the morning of the hearing finally arrived, the courthouse was packed beyond capacity. The air inside the hearing room felt heavy, charged with expectation. Journalists adjusted their cameras and microphones, while city officials and lawyers filled the rows, whispering nervously. At precisely 9 a.m., Michael entered the courtroom, projecting confidence despite the rapid beating of his heart. Across the aisle sat Judge Braxton, dressed impeccably, his face a mask of detached professionalism, though his fingers drummed anxiously against the table. "All rise," called the clerk, and a panel of 3 judges from the Judicial Review Commission entered solemnly, signaling the seriousness of the proceedings. Once seated, Judge Eleanor Carmichael, presiding over the panel, spoke clearly. "We're gathered here today to examine allegations of judicial misconduct and systemic bias in the courtroom of Judge Stephen Braxton. Prosecutor Everett, please present your findings." Michael stood and walked calmly to the podium, pausing briefly to steady himself. The eyes of the entire courtroom were upon him, cameras flashing subtly from the back. He adjusted the microphone and began with measured authority. "Thank you, Your Honor," Michael started. "My name is Michael Everett, and I serve as an assistant U.S. attorney. Approximately 1 month ago, I personally experienced a troubling example of disparate treatment from Judge Braxton. While disturbing, my experience pales compared to the pattern we uncovered subsequently." He clicked a remote, activating the large screen behind him, where charts and photographs appeared, carefully documenting Braxton's record. In the past 5 years, Black defendants appearing before Judge Braxton were fined an average of 270% more than white defendants for identical infractions. Late arrivals, like the one I myself experienced, resulted in disproportionately severe penalties for African Americans. White defendants, however, frequently received warnings or significantly lesser penalties. Murmurs spread throughout the courtroom. Braxton shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes narrowing. Michael continued methodically, presenting damning evidence piece by piece, displaying court records, comparing fines, and reading excerpts from Monica Rivera's meticulous notes. Then, he took a deep breath and called Gloria Richardson, the elderly woman he had interviewed earlier, as his first witness. Gloria approached cautiously, her dignity unwavering. Her testimony was concise, heartfelt, and powerful. "I was made to feel like I had no voice," Gloria told the room, her eyes meeting Braxton's directly. "I was fined heavily and dismissed quickly." Moments later, a white defendant with a similar issue was excused entirely. It felt humiliating. Following Gloria, Monica Rivera took the stand. Visibly nervous but resolute, she detailed her observations as Braxton's former clerk. She recounted biased remarks made privately by Braxton, noting his clear differential treatment of defendants based on race. Her testimony cemented the systemic nature of Braxton's misconduct. When Michael finally rested his case, a charged silence enveloped the room. Judge Carmichael turned toward Braxton's counsel, signaling it was their turn. Braxton's attorney, William Dunlap, stood briskly, exuding a practiced confidence. "These allegations," Dunlap began, his tone dismissive, "are simply selective interpretations and misunderstandings of judicial discretion. Judge Braxton has served this community honorably for decades." As Dunlap spoke, Braxton himself appeared increasingly agitated, his mask of neutrality cracking under the weight of evidence and testimony. Michael watched him closely, noting the slight tremble in his hand as he scribbled notes furiously. Finally, after 2 hours of testimony and rebuttal, the hearing recessed briefly. Journalists swarmed Michael in the hallway, bombarding him with questions, their microphones pushing toward his face. "Mr. Everett, are you accusing Judge Braxton of racism?" one reporter asked bluntly. Michael paused thoughtfully before responding. "This hearing isn't about one person's heart or intentions. It's about accountability and fairness in our justice system. Every citizen deserves equal treatment under the law. If we ignore bias, whether intentional or systemic, we betray the very foundations of justice. His statement resonated through the reporters, many scribbling notes furiously. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment clearly. Michael's calm resolve contrasting sharply with Braxton's deteriorating composure. Returning to the hearing room, Michael felt a cautious optimism. The evidence presented had been overwhelming, yet he knew the real battle wasn't just here. It was in the broader public consciousness. Change required not only legal accountability, but sustained awareness and advocacy. When Judge Carmichael called the hearing back into session, the commission's conclusion came swiftly. Given the compelling evidence presented, she declared gravely, the commission will initiate a full disciplinary review of Judge Stephen Braxton. Pending the review, he will be suspended immediately from judicial duties. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by muted applause from the public gallery. Braxton's shoulders slumped visibly, shock registering plainly on his face. As the hearing adjourned, Michael met Braxton's gaze briefly, noticing for the first time a glint of genuine fear. But Michael felt no joy, only a profound sense of responsibility for what lay ahead. Stepping outside into the sunlight, he faced a throng of reporters, community members, and activists waiting for him. Among them was Gloria Richardson, who approached gently, taking his hand in gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes moist. "You made our voices matter." "No," Michael corrected gently. "You were always heard. Today, we just made everyone else listen." As cameras clicked, capturing this quiet yet powerful exchange, Michael knew this moment would resonate far beyond Greenville. His actions had sparked a necessary reckoning, exposing truths long hidden in plain sight. Yet he understood that this was only a beginning. The fight for real, lasting change had just begun. In the weeks following the dramatic hearing, Michael Everett found his professional life fundamentally transformed. The media attention had thrust him into the national spotlight, turning his routine days as a federal prosecutor into a whirlwind of interviews, panel discussions, and invitations to speak at legal forums across the country. Initially reluctant to step into such a public role, Michael soon recognized the significance of what he'd ignited. The conversation about systemic bias in courtrooms had rapidly escalated into a nationwide dialogue. Activist groups, legal scholars, and politicians seized the opportunity to call for comprehensive judicial reforms, demanding transparency, accountability, and fairness. Michael was invited to speak at law schools from South Carolina to California. At each stop, eager law students crowded auditoriums, captivated by the story of one attorney who stood up against entrenched injustice. After one lecture at UCLA, a young black law student approached him, her voice filled with emotion. "Your courage inspired me to reconsider my path," she said earnestly. "I almost left law school feeling disillusioned, thinking the system was too broken. But now I see clearly that someone has to stay and fight to fix it." Michael felt humbled, deeply aware that his stand had become larger than himself. "Never doubt that your voice matters," he told her. "Real change often begins with one person brave enough to speak." Back in Greenville, the impact was tangible. A special judicial oversight committee had been formed by the South Carolina Supreme Court, led by Judge Eleanor Carmichael. Their first act was conducting rigorous audits of courtroom proceedings across the state. Findings were alarming. Numerous courts exhibited patterns of racial and socioeconomic disparities similar to Judge Braxton's. In response, the committee mandated comprehensive anti-bias training for all state judges and court staff, bringing experts from around the country to lead discussions on implicit bias and fairness in judicial decision-making. Monica Rivera, Braxton's former clerk, whose meticulous notes had helped expose the misconduct, was asked to lead a clerical oversight unit, dedicated to monitoring and reporting fairness in courtroom administration. Michael regularly checked in with Monica, who had blossomed in her new role. Once reserved and cautious, she now spoke confidently at community events, educating residents about their legal rights. "I spent years watching injustice happen quietly," she admitted during one gathering. "Now I see clearly that silence only protects injustice." At the Greenville Municipal Courthouse, the atmosphere had shifted profoundly. Judge Braxton formally resigned after the disciplinary review found conclusive evidence of his biased practices. He left without a public statement, quietly fading from the city's legal circles. In his place, the South Carolina judiciary appointed Judge Angela Bennett, a respected jurist with a reputation for impartiality and fairness. Under Judge Bennett's watch, procedural changes were swift and substantial. An information desk staffed by bilingual employees was established, ensuring every defendant clearly understood their rights and available options. Defendants facing financial hardships were proactively offered payment plans or community service alternatives rather than punitive fines, reducing financial burdens that had disproportionately impacted minority communities. Bailiff James Parker, who had served silently for years under Braxton, stepped into a new role training court security personnel, teaching them how to recognize and prevent potential biases within courtroom dynamics. At one session, Michael listened proudly as Parker shared his own reflections. "For a long time, I thought my job was just to maintain order," Parker explained to a room filled with young bailiffs. "But I realize now it's bigger than that. Our responsibility is ensuring that everyone who walks through these doors knows justice applies equally to them." Nationally, Michael's actions continued to resonate. The Department of Justice, inspired by the Greenville investigation, launched a federal initiative, Justice for All, auditing municipal courts nationwide for racial disparities in fines and sentencing. Other states soon followed, creating judicial oversight commissions modeled after South Carolina's initiative. Yet, despite the accolades and systemic reforms, Michael found his greatest satisfaction came from the quieter, more personal moments. Letters arrived regularly at his office, handwritten notes from individuals across America thanking him for speaking out, sharing their own stories of courtroom injustice, or expressing renewed hope for fairness within the legal system. One letter in particular stayed with him. It was from an elderly woman in Montgomery, Alabama. "Dear Mr. Everett, I have lived long enough to see many promises made and broken. But your stand against injustice reminded me of something Dr. King once said, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Thank you for reminding us to keep bending it forward." Michael kept this letter framed beside the fine Judge Braxton had imposed, both hanging prominently in his office as daily reminders of why he fought. Exactly 1 year after his fateful morning in Braxton's courtroom, Michael returned to the newly renovated Greenville Courthouse for the unveiling of a judicial ethics center, a direct result of the reforms he'd set in motion. Judges, attorneys, activists, and community members gathered in the bright, freshly painted hall, its walls decorated with murals emphasizing equality, justice, and diversity. As Michael stepped to the podium, the applause that greeted him was warm, genuine, and powerful. He scanned the room, recognizing faces from every stage of this journey. Monica Rivera and James Parker, now leaders in judicial reform. Julia Sanders, whose support had been unwavering, and Gloria Richardson, who sat proudly in the front row, her eyes moist with pride. "Justice," Michael began clearly, his voice resonating through the hall, "is not merely an abstract ideal. It's lived every day, in every courtroom, and in every decision we make. A truly just society demands vigilance, courage, and honesty about where we fall short." The crowd listened intently as he continued, his words firm yet hopeful. "Our journey began with an uncomfortable truth, but the discomfort of confronting injustice is essential. Without it, there can be no growth. This center and the reforms we've enacted symbolize more than procedural changes. They represent our collective decision to say enough to unfairness, bias, and inequality. Applause erupted again, louder this time, sustained by a shared determination felt deeply throughout the room. In the months that followed, Michael continued teaching, mentoring young attorneys, and speaking publicly. The impact of his stand against Judge Braxton had inspired a new generation of legal minds determined to dismantle systemic bias wherever it appeared. When he spoke, he often ended with the same simple yet powerful message. Remember, he would say, one voice can indeed ignite change. But lasting justice requires many voices. It requires each of us, no matter our role, to choose courage over comfort, action over silence, and fairness above all else. Years later, Michael's name became synonymous with judicial reform in South Carolina and beyond. He had not planned to become a national figure, nor had he set out to lead a movement. Yet he realized that true change rarely comes from grand gestures alone. More often, it begins with a single moment of moral clarity, a decision to speak up, stand firm, and insist upon justice. As Michael walked through the bustling courthouse halls, now brighter and more welcoming, he saw young attorneys enthusiastically discussing cases, defendants treated with dignity, and staff members empowered to question unfairness. He recognized a truth he'd long hoped for. This was no longer merely his fight. It belonged to everyone. And in that moment, Michael Everett knew his greatest victory wasn't simply exposing injustice. It was inspiring countless others to believe they, too, could make a difference. What is the lesson of this story? 1. One voice can ignite change. Michael Everett's decision to stand up against injustice shows us that one person's courage can spark powerful reforms. Never underestimate your ability to make a difference. 2. Silence protects injustice. Staying quiet in the face of unfairness allows it to continue. Real change demands we speak out, even when it's uncomfortable or risky. 3. Justice must be equal. Fairness and equality aren't optional. True justice exists only when everyone, regardless of race or background, is treated equally under the law. 4. Integrity demands action. Recognizing injustice isn't enough. We must actively challenge and address it. Integrity requires taking a stand, even when it's difficult. What do you think about this story? Let's comment below to discuss them, Beth. And don't forget to subscribe our channel to listen to more interesting stories.